The cold silence of space stretched for miles, broken only by the hum of the wreckage. Kaylin, a young alien girl, opened her eyes to the darkness. Her head throbbed with pain. The last thing she remembered was the sudden explosion that tore through her family's ship. Her home, a sleek Zetheri vessel, had been nothing but a shell of twisted metal now. She couldn't understand what had happened or why she had survived. The others, her family, her people, were gone. Kaylin sat up, her heart racing. Panic washed over her as she looked around the wreckage. The control panels, once full of life and energy, now lay broken, their lights flickering weakly. The ship had crashed into an unknown planet, its surface visible through a crack in the outer shell. Kaylin's long, thin fingers trembled as she tried to push herself up. She had to find out where she was. She had to survive. The Zetheri were a peaceful race, known for their telepathic abilities. They could feel the emotions of others, sensing their thoughts and intentions, a gift that often made them peaceful and kind. But Kaylin was different. She was still young, and her abilities hadn't fully developed. In times of stress, like now, her telepathy was unpredictable. She could feel the faint emotions of creatures around her, but she couldn't quite understand them. It made her feel alone, disconnected from the world. She stood, using the remains of the ship's control panel for support, and looked out through the crack in the hull. Below, the planet's surface was rocky and barren. There was no sign of life. Kaylin's heart sank. She was alone. No one knew where she was. The Zetheri fleet had been scattered, and there was no way to call for help. She had no choice but to survive. Her thoughts turned to her family. Where were they? What happened to them? She reached out with her mind, trying to find any trace of them, but all she felt was the emptiness of space, the cold absence of their presence. It was as if they had vanished completely. Kaylin swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't stay in the wreckage forever. She needed to find food, water, shelter. But where? How? She was alone, and the planet below was foreign to her. Her telepathic abilities couldn't help her here. She was far from home, and she had no idea what dangers lurked in this strange place. With a deep breath, Kaylin stepped away from the wreckage and made her way toward the planet's surface. The ship's landing gear had crumpled on impact, leaving her no choice but to climb down through the twisted metal. She moved cautiously, her senses alert for any signs of danger. The planet seemed eerily quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. As she made her way down, Kaylin's mind kept drifting back to her people. They had been fleeing from something dangerous. She didn't fully understand it, but she had heard whispers of a conflict among the Zetheri. Her family had been part of a group trying to escape a rising political struggle. It wasn't the first time they had been forced to flee, but it was supposed to be their final escape. They had hoped to find a new peaceful world to settle on. But now that dream was shattered, just like the ship. Finally, Kaylin reached the ground. She stumbled slightly, the harsh surface of the planet beneath her feet rough and uneven. She looked around, taking in her surroundings. The sky above was a dull gray, with thick clouds swirling ominously. There were no signs of life. No plants, no animals, just the lifeless rocks stretching out before her. It was as if this world had been abandoned long ago. She moved forward, her thoughts racing. How long would it take before her supplies ran out? Could she find anything to help her survive? She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, but the faint flicker of her ship's power core told her it wouldn't last much longer. As Kaylin walked, she kept her eyes trained on the ground, searching for any sign of life. She couldn't risk being careless. She had to stay focused. The emptiness of the planet weighed heavily on her, and the fear of being truly alone pressed down on her chest. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Kaylin paused for a moment, trying to sense anything with her mind. She reached out, focusing on the emptiness around her. There was nothing. No emotions, no thoughts, just the cold, empty silence of the planet. She shivered and began walking again, determined to find something, anything, that could help her. But deep inside, a voice whispered to her, telling her that her survival might depend on more than just herself. In this vast, empty world, she was no longer sure if she could trust her own instincts. Could she survive alone? Or was she destined to perish on this desolate rock, forgotten by the stars? The planet was still. There was nothing but the sound of wind rustling against the jagged rocks. Kaylin moved cautiously, her eyes darting between the dark horizon and the rough ground beneath her feet. She had been walking for what felt like hours, but the landscape remained unchanged. The air was dry, and each step she took seemed to echo in the emptiness. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Her mind, still struggling with the loss of her family, wandered to thoughts of survival. She had food, only enough for a few days, maybe a week at most. Water, however, was a different matter. The planet had no obvious sources, and Kaylin knew she couldn't survive long without it. She felt the weight of her isolation, the loneliness pressing against her chest. She could no longer feel her people, her family. The cold emptiness of the planet seemed to swallow everything, even her thoughts. Suddenly, a strange sound broke the silence. It was distant, like the faint rumble of an engine. Kaylin stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. She had been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't heard anyone approach. Could it be another ship? Someone else stranded here like her? She crouched behind a boulder, peering over the edge. In the distance, she saw something moving. A small craft, low to the ground, making its way across the rocky landscape. It wasn't as sleek and advanced as the Zetheri ships, but it was clearly a spacecraft of some kind. A human ship, perhaps. Kaylin had heard of humans. There were rumors of their daring adventures and their ability to survive in the harshest environments. She had never met one, but she had heard enough stories to know that they were resourceful. Kaylin's heart skipped a beat. If it was a human, there was a chance they could help her. But there was also the chance they might see her as a threat or worse, as something to exploit. She didn't know what to do. Her instincts told her to hide, to stay out of sight, but something inside her urged her to take a chance. She had nothing to lose. With a deep breath, Kaylin stood and moved toward the ship, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. She didn't know how long it would take for the ship to get closer, but she couldn't afford to waste any time. Every moment counted. As she got closer, she noticed the ship's markings, a symbol she didn't recognize. It wasn't Zetheri, nor was it from any of the nearby alien factions she had encountered in her short life. It was something entirely new. The ship was a rusted, patched-up vessel, clearly designed for survival in hostile environments. It looked like it had seen better days. Kaylin felt a strange mixture of hope and fear as she approached the landing site. She couldn't help but wonder who the person inside was. Were they a traveler, lost like her? Or were they a predator, waiting to take advantage of a stranded alien? Just as the ship touched down, the hatch opened with a hiss and a figure stepped out. Kaylin froze. The human was tall, wearing a worn-out suit that looked like it had been through countless repairs. He had short, dark hair and a rugged face, hardened by years of surviving on his own. His eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings, alert for any danger. When he looked in Kaylin's direction, she quickly ducked behind a large rock, holding her breath. The human didn't seem to notice her at first. He moved around his ship, checking equipment and making adjustments. Kaylin waited, hoping he wouldn't spot her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her telepathic abilities reacting to the presence of another living being. His emotions were distant, guarded. He seemed like someone who had been alone for a long time, someone who didn't trust easily. She waited for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing. She had to make a decision. If she didn't act now, the human might leave. She couldn't risk being alone again, stranded on this barren planet with no one to help her. Gathering all her courage, Kaylin stepped out from behind the rock. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She didn't want to startle him. When the human finally saw her, His expression shifted from curiosity to caution. He didn't make any sudden moves, but Kaylin could sense the tension in his body. She raised her hands, signaling that she meant no harm. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, reaching out with her mind to convey that she was in need of help, but her telepathy was weak, her emotions scattered from the ordeal. The human took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. Kaylin could feel his confusion, but there was also something else, a spark of recognition, maybe even empathy. He didn't seem entirely sure what to make of her, but he didn't back away either. Instead, he spoke, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "You lost?" he asked, his tone cautious but not unkind. Kaylin nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I need help. My ship crashed." The human didn't say anything for a moment. He seemed to be thinking, weighing his options. Kaylin could feel his skepticism, but also a flicker of something else, something deeper. He wasn't the type to turn away someone in need. Finally, he sighed and extended his hand. "All right, let's see what we can do." For the first time in what felt like forever, Kaylin felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't truly alone. The two of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Kaylin's heart was still racing, but she tried to calm herself. This human, despite his rough exterior, seemed to be offering help. Her mind struggled to understand why. Humans were often seen as unpredictable, sometimes aggressive, but Kaylin had learned not to judge by rumors. She had seen enough of the galaxy to know that everyone had their own story. The human looked at her for a few seconds longer, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, he spoke again. "I'm Miles. Miles Carter." His voice was steady, but there was something in it that hinted at years of surviving alone. "You're lucky I spotted you. The planet's not exactly friendly." Kaylin nodded slowly. She had been alone for so long, and now, for the first time since the crash, she was standing in front of another person. She couldn't quite figure out how she felt. Relief, fear, confusion. All of it swirled inside her, but she kept her composure. She had learned to survive through her people's teachings. Stay calm, stay focused. She took a deep breath. "I'm Colin. My ship, it crashed. I don't know where I am," she said softly. Her voice trembled slightly, but she hid it behind a composed exterior. Miles studied her for a moment before nodding, his expression softening just a little. "I figured. This place is way off the usual routes. Not many come here unless they're desperate." Kaylin felt a spark of hope at his words. Desperation was something they shared, in a way. But she knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough to survive. The planet was harsh, and even if Miles meant well, she couldn't rely on him forever. She needed a plan. "So, what's your plan?" Colin asked, trying to keep the fear from creeping into her voice. Miles rubbed his chin and glanced at the broken-down ship. "Well, I've got some basic supplies on my ship. I can't promise I have much, but it's better than nothing. We'll need to figure out a way to get you more water, though." The thought of water made Colin's stomach tighten. She had been feeling thirsty for a while now, but the dryness of the air made it hard to think clearly. She had to find some way to stay hydrated. Her mind kept flashing back to her family's ship, wondering if there was anything left in the wreckage that could help. "Will you help me gather my things?" Kaylin asked, a little hesitant but determined. "I need to see if I can salvage anything from the wreck." Miles didn't hesitate. "I'll go with you. It's not safe to wander out here alone." They'd moved together toward the wreckage, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. As they walked, Kaylin's mind raced. The ship had been torn apart in the crash, but there might still be some parts she could use. She had a knack for working with technology. After all, her people had created advanced machines capable of amazing feats. Maybe there was something she could repair or repurpose. But she had no tools and no experience with human technology. Reaching the wreckage, they began to search. Miles was surprisingly methodical. He had clearly done this kind of work before. Kalen watched as he pulled open a panel and began checking the power systems. His hands moved quickly, clearly used to handling broken machinery. Kalen turned her attention to the remains of her family ship, feeling a pang of sadness at the sight of it. She had spent so many years on this vessel, learning from her elders and dreaming of the future. But now it was just twisted metal and shattered glass. She found a small compartment that had been torn open, but to her surprise, inside was a small supply of food and water. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Hey, look at this," she said, pulling the water bottles from the wreckage. "I've got some supplies here." Miles turned and smiled, his eyes lighting up. "Good find. That'll help us get by for a while." For the first time since the crash, Kalen allowed herself to feel a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. She wasn't completely alone anymore. The human, Miles, had helped her find something vital. He had shared his knowledge without hesitation, and in return, she had found what little remained of her ship's resources. As they gathered the last of the supplies, Miles paused and looked at her. "You don't seem like the usual person I'd find on a planet like this. What's your story?" Kalen hesitated. She didn't want to share too much. Not yet. She didn't know how much she could trust him. But there was something about him, something in the way he had approached her, offering help without question, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could share a little more. "I'm from a place far away," she said softly. "My people, we were forced to leave. There was a conflict, and we were trying to escape. But something happened, and I was separated from my family." Miles listened quietly, his face serious. "Sounds like you've had a rough time." Kalen nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I don't know if anyone else survived. I was alone when I woke up." "I understand," Miles said, his voice soft. "I've been alone too. It's not easy, but sometimes all you can do is keep moving forward." Kalen looked at him, sensing that his words weren't just about survival. He was speaking from experience. She could feel a connection forming between them, however unlikely it seemed. In this strange, cold place, two lost souls had found each other. "We'll make it," Miles added with a slight grin. "One way or another." Kalen didn't know if she fully believed him, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The days began to blur together for Kalen and Miles. The planet's barren landscape offered little for them to do except gather resources and figure out how to survive. Miles had been more helpful than Kalen had expected, using his knowledge of survival to teach her new ways of gathering food and water. He was resourceful and practical, qualities Kalen could respect. But the longer they stayed, the more Kalen couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something important, something that might change everything. She often found herself staring at the small memory crystal she had salvaged from the wreckage of her family ship. It was the only thing she had left of her people, and it contained information that could alter the future of the Zethari. But Kalen couldn't bring herself to open it. The knowledge inside was too dangerous, too powerful. Her people had kept it hidden for a reason. And now, with no one else around, she feared what might happen if anyone discovered it. One afternoon, as they sat by the remnants of the ship, Kalen found herself staring at the crystal again. Miles was working on a broken piece of his ship, his hands busy with the tools he had managed to salvage. He had been quiet lately, lost in his own thoughts, just as she had been. She couldn't help but wonder if he ever thought about his own past, about why he ended up alone on this desolate planet. Her curiosity got the better of her. She had to know more about him. If she was going to trust him with anything, she needed to understand who he was. "Why are you out here, Miles?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "What brought you to this planet? You said it's not a place people come to by choice." Miles paused for a moment, his hand stilling as he glanced over at her. His eyes were distant, and for a moment, Kalen wasn't sure if he was going to answer. But then he sighed and wiped his hands on his jacket. You could say I'm running from my past, he said quietly. I used to work for a big company, doing dangerous jobs. Mining, exploration, you name it. But I got tired of it, the danger, the greed, the way people treat each other like tools. He shook his head. I left, came out here to get away from all of it. Thought I'd be free. But turns out, freedom comes with its own kind of weight. Kaylin listened intently, sensing that there was more he wasn't saying. But she didn't press him. Miles had shared more than she had expected, and she understood what it was like to run from something. Her people, her past. But unlike Miles, she didn't have the luxury of running forever. There were things she had to face, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the memory crystal might be the key to everything. I used to have a family, Kaylin said softly, more to herself than to Miles. My people, we were peaceful, but not everyone agreed with us. Some saw our powers as a threat. I don't know if they were right, but I do know that we had to run. Miles looked at her, his expression serious but understanding. It's not easy, running from your past, he said. But sometimes you have to do it to survive. We can't change what happened, but we can decide what we do with what's left. Kaylin nodded, her thoughts still on the memory crystal. The knowledge it contained was far too dangerous for just anyone to know. It wasn't just a simple recording. It held the secrets of her people's most sacred teachings. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. That's why she had kept it hidden, even from Miles. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no escaping the truth. She couldn't keep running forever. She needed to know what was inside the crystal, and if the human was going to help her, he needed to understand. I have something, Kaylin said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small crystal. It's a memory crystal. It contains everything about my people's history, our powers, and the conflict we were running from. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. Miles looked at her curiously, but there was no judgment in his eyes. He was quiet for a moment before nodding. Sounds like something worth protecting. But why keep it hidden from me? Kaylin hesitated, because I don't know if I can trust you. You're different. I don't know what humans would do with this kind of power. Miles didn't seem offended. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if understanding. I get it. It's a big decision. But you don't have to make it alone. Kaylin felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe Miles was someone she could trust. Maybe he wasn't just a wanderer, lost in space like her. Maybe he was something more. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice breaking. I don't want to make the same mistakes my people made, but I don't want to run anymore. I want to face whatever comes. Miles stood up and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it out together. Whatever's in that crystal, we'll find a way to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. You're not alone anymore. Kaylin's heart lifted at his words. For the first time since the crash, she felt like maybe she had found someone who understood her. Maybe together, they could change the future. But as she looked out across the barren landscape, she knew that whatever they did next would set the course for everything. The secrets of the Zetheri were powerful and dangerous, but Kaylin was ready to face whatever came. With Miles by her side, she had a chance. The night fell quietly over the planet, a cold stillness hanging in the air. Kaylin and Miles sat around a small fire they had built using dry wood they'd found nearby. The flames flickered gently, casting shadows on their faces. Kaylin stared into the fire, her mind racing. She had shared her secret, the one thing she had kept hidden for so long. Now the burden of what to do with the knowledge inside the memory crystal weighed heavily on her shoulders. But there was something else, something she hadn't told Miles. She couldn't. Not yet. Tomorrow, we need to explore further, Miles said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but firm. We're running low on food, and I don't trust that there's enough to survive much longer. We should try to find a larger settlement or at least a better source of water. Kalen nodded, grateful for his practicality. It was easy to lose focus when the weight of the situation was too heavy. But Miles had a way of keeping things grounded, always thinking ahead. She didn't like the idea of leaving the wreckage of her family ship behind, but she knew he was right. Staying here would only slow them down. They needed to find a way off this planet, if that was even possible. "What do you think we'll find?" Cullen asked, glancing up at the stars. The sky was dark, but there was a strange sense of peace in the emptiness. It reminded her of her home, the stars that used to shine brightly above her people's world. She felt a pang of longing, a reminder of what she had lost. Miles paused, looking up at the same stars. "Hard to say. This planet's not exactly on any maps I've seen, but there's always a chance. People come from all over to try and make a living here, even if it's dangerous. If we're lucky, we might find someone who can help. Or we might find more danger," Callan said quietly. Miles chuckled softly. "Yeah, that too. But we don't have much of a choice, do we?" Callan didn't respond. She knew he was right. They were both stranded here, with no other options but to keep moving forward. She could only hope that wherever they ended up, it would be a place where they could find safety and answers. As the fire burned low, Kaylin felt the weight of the memory crystal in her pack. It was a constant reminder of the knowledge she carried, knowledge that could change everything. But she didn't know how to use it. She had to be careful. She couldn't risk handing it over to the wrong person. Not after everything her people had sacrificed to keep it hidden. The next morning they set out at dawn, moving cautiously across the rocky terrain. The wind was biting, and the air felt thin and dry. Miles led the way, keeping a steady pace, while Colin followed behind, scanning the horizon. She could sense his determination, his focus on the journey ahead. But Callan had her own concerns. She couldn't help but wonder if they were being watched. The planet was full of strange creatures, some of which were dangerous, others simply curious. Callan had already encountered a few, and each time, she had kept her distance. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. They traveled for hours, their path winding through desolate valleys and rocky hills. Callan's mind kept drifting back to the memory crystal. What would happen if she opened it? What if it held the answers to her people's survival, but also the key to their destruction? She couldn't be sure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they came across a small settlement. It wasn't much, just a cluster of crude buildings huddled together at the base of a mountain. The smell of burning wood hung in the air, and Kaylin could hear voices coming from the small market area. It was a strange sight. People living in such harsh conditions, trying to make the best of a planet that had little to offer. Miles led her into the settlement cautiously. They passed a few people who eyed them warily, but no one seemed interested in making trouble. Kaylin couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though. It wasn't just the eyes of the locals, it was something else. A sense of unease settled over her, and she couldn't explain why. They approached a building that looked like it might be a trading post. The door was made of thick wood, and a sign above it read "Goods and Supplies." Miles knocked twice, and the door creaked open. A man with graying hair and a weathered face appeared in the doorway, eyeing them up and down. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice rough, like it had been years since it had been used in a friendly conversation. "We're in need of supplies," Miles said, his tone steady. "Food, water, anything you can spare." The man looked them over before stepping aside and letting them in. "I've got some water and rations," he said, "but you'll have to trade for it." "Trade?" Kellen asked, glancing at Miles. She wasn't sure what they had to offer in exchange. The man's gaze turned sharp. "I'm not running a charity here. If you want something, you'll need to earn it." Kalen wasn't sure if he was suspicious of them or just a typical businessman. But they didn't have much to offer. Nothing of value, really. At least not yet. "We can work," Miles said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll trade labor for what we need." The man seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. All right, I've got some work that needs doing. You help me out, and I'll give you what you need." Kaylin glanced at Miles, relieved to have made some progress. They weren't out of options yet. They might not know who they could trust, but they could still survive. Together, they would find a way. The work was harder than Callan had expected. The man who owned the trading post, a gruff man named Zeth, put them to work right away. They spent hours repairing small structures, collecting firewood, and even cleaning out storage spaces. It was exhausting, but Kaylin didn't mind. She was used to hard work, and more importantly, it kept her mind from wandering back to the memory crystal in her pack. That crystal held too many unanswered questions, questions that she wasn't ready to face. By the time evening arrived, both she and Miles were covered in dust and sweat. The work had given them the energy they needed, but it hadn't made the tension between them disappear. Kaylin could sense that Miles was more distant now, and it wasn't just because of the labor. He had his own demons, and she knew that. But she also knew that they couldn't afford to stay isolated forever. Zeth had kept his word. He handed them a small supply of water and some dried food in exchange for their help. It wasn't enough to last them for long, but it would get them through another few days. Miles had spoken little during their time working, but Kaylin could tell he was thinking. He was always thinking. As they made their way back to the outskirts of the settlement, Kaylin finally broke the silence. "We can't stay here long," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We have to keep moving." "I know," Miles replied, his voice low. "But we can't keep running forever. We need a plan." Helen looked at him, wondering what he meant. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't thought much beyond that. But Miles was right. They couldn't keep wandering aimlessly through this planet forever. They needed something more than just food and water. "I know what you mean," Kellen said after a pause. "But we don't know who we can trust here. And even if we find someone who can help us, we still have no idea how to get off this planet." Miles nodded. "I get it. But we've got to start somewhere. And right now, that means staying under the radar. If we can find more people who know this place, maybe we can figure out a way to leave." As they walked in silence, Kaylin felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her once again. The memory crystal, the key to her people's secrets, was burning a hole in her pack. She could feel its power, the knowledge it held, and it was more than she could bear alone. She had to make a decision soon. That night, as the stars spread out like glitter above them, Kaylin lay awake in the small shelter they had made, listening to the sounds of the settlement. The crackle of distant fires, the murmurs of voices, all felt like an eerie reminder of how much she had lost. The next morning, they set out early. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a pale light over the rugged terrain. They walked in silence for a while, neither of them knowing exactly where they were headed. Their goal was simple: find more supplies, find more answers. As they moved through the barren landscape, they came across a narrow canyon. The walls were steep and the ground was uneven, but there was something about it that caught Colin's attention. She paused, scanning the area. Miles noticed and stopped beside her. "What's wrong?" he asked. Kaylin looked down at the ground, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know. I just have this feeling that we're being washed." Miles scanned the canyon with a cautious eye. "It's probably just the wind or some animal. You're jumpy." "I'm not just jumpy," Callan said. "There's something here. Something out of place." They moved cautiously into the canyon, every step echoing in the quiet air. The walls loomed above them, blocking out most of the light. The further they went, the more Colin's unease grew. It wasn't just the feeling of being washed. It was something deeper. The air itself seemed to carry a strange energy, as if the canyon was hiding something. Suddenly, they heard a sound, a faint rustling from above. Kaylin immediately looked up, her senses on high alert. Miles did the same. There, high on the canyon walls, something moved, something large. Kaylin's heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I see it, Miles replied, but I don't like it. A shadow passed overhead, followed by a series of clicking noises. Kaylin's instincts kicked in. She immediately pulled Miles to the side, ducking behind a large rock outcrop. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. "Something's watching us, and I don't think it's friendly." Miles nodded, his face grim. "I've had enough of this place." They turned and began moving quickly, carefully making their way back toward the open ground. But as they reached the mouth of the canyon, the sound of movement behind them grew louder. They were being followed. Kaylin's heart raced. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they didn't want to be caught. Miles was already ahead of her, urging her to move faster. But Kaylin's eyes kept darting to the shadows, looking for signs of what was chasing them. A sudden movement made her freeze. Something large dropped from above, landing with a thud right in front of her. It was a creature, massive and shadowy, with eyes that glowed in the dim light. Its body was covered in scales, and its claws clicked against the rocks as it advanced toward them. "Run," Miles shouted, his voice urgent. Without thinking, Kaylin turned and sprinted after him, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't something they could fight. They had to escape. They had no other choice. The air was thick with tension as Kaylin and Miles sprinted across the rocky terrain, the sound of the creature's claws scraping against the stone echoing in the distance. The canyon walls rose behind them, blocking their path and offering no refuge. They had to get out of there. The creature was relentless, its heavy steps growing louder as it closed in on them. Kaylin's legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder, desperate to outpace whatever was hunting them. Miles was a few steps ahead, but the uneven ground made it difficult to gain any real distance. The creature was fast, its glowing eyes flickering in and out of sight as it moved through the canyon like a shadow. "Miles," Kaylin called, her voice strained. "We need to find cover." Miles glanced back over his shoulder, his face pale with fear but determined. "We're not going to outrun it. We need a plan." Kaylin's mind raced. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed to fight back, or at least slow the creature down. But how? She looked around, searching for anything that might give them an edge. The canyon walls were too steep to climb, and the ground offered no place to hide. Suddenly, her gaze landed on the memory crystal in her pack. It was a small, insignificant object, but in that moment, it felt like the key to everything. The secrets it held, the knowledge of her people, could be the only thing that made a difference now. "Miles," Kaylin shouted, stopping in her tracks. "I have something. A way to stop it." Miles skidded to a halt, looking confused. "What are you talking about?" "Now's not the time to." "I have a weapon," Kaylin interrupted. "Not a normal weapon, but something more powerful. My people used it to defend themselves. If I can unlock it, it might give us a chance." Miles looked uncertain. "Are you sure? You don't know what's inside that thing. It could make things worse." Kaylin's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew what she had to do. The creature was closing in, its growls filling the air. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. She pulled the memory crystal from her pack and held it in her hands, staring at it with a mix of fear and hope. "This is our only chance," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I have to trust it. I have to trust myself." Kaylin closed her eyes, reaching out with her mind to connect with the crystal. She could feel the energy within it, a deep, ancient power that pulsed like a living thing. The teachings of her people, their strength, their knowledge, everything was locked inside. She focused, letting the energy flow through her, trying to access the hidden power that had been passed down for generations. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for a brief moment, everything around her seemed to shift. The creature's growl grew louder, but it wasn't the only sound. The air crackled with energy, and Kaylin's body hummed with power. Suddenly, the memory crystal flared to life, its light blinding. Kaylin gasped as the knowledge within it flooded her mind. She felt the power of her people's ancient defenses surge through her. And before she could fully comprehend what was happening, a wave of energy erupted from her hands. It surged outward, a force of pure energy that slammed into the canyon walls and sent rocks tumbling to the ground. The creature let out a deafening roar, thrown back by the force of the blast. It staggered, disoriented, and confused, but it wasn't finished yet. It quickly regained its footing and turned toward them, its glowing eyes filled with rage. Kaylin's breath came in ragged gasps. The power was overwhelming, but she couldn't stop now. She had to finish this. She focused again, gathering the energy within her, shaping it into a protective barrier. "Miles, get behind me," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the creature. Miles didn't hesitate. He scrambled behind her, his eyes wide with disbelief. Kaylin's mind was a blur, her thoughts consumed by the power surging through her. She wasn't sure how long she could hold this energy, but she knew it was their only hope. The creature lunged, its claws reaching for her, but the energy barrier held firm. The creature slammed into it with incredible force, its claws scraping against the invisible wall. Kaylin gritted her teeth, her body trembling with the strain of maintaining the barrier. "You can do it," Miles shouted from behind her. "Just hold on." Kaylin didn't respond. She couldn't. Her focus was entirely on the creature, pushing all of her strength into the barrier to keep it from breaking through. The creature roared again, its rage echoing through the canyon, but Kaylin stood firm. She would not let it win. Slowly, she began to push the energy outward, forcing the creature back. It struggled, but Kaylin's power was too much for it to handle. Finally, with one final burst of energy, she unleashed everything she had. The creature was thrown backward, slamming into the canyon walls with a deafening crash. For a moment, there was silence. The air was still, and the canyon seemed to hold its breath. Kaylin lowered her hands, her body shaking from the effort. She felt weak, drained, but alive. The creature was no longer moving, its body crumpled in the dust. It was over. Miles stood behind her, staring at the creature in disbelief. "That was incredible. How did you do that?" Kaylin looked down at the memory crystal in her hand, its light now dimming. She was still processing the power she had just unleashed, but she knew one thing for sure. She had done what she had to do to protect herself. And Miles. "I didn't do it alone," Kaylin said quietly. "This is the power of my people. I just unlocked it." Miles nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. "You did what you had to do. And now we can move forward." Kaylin looked up at the sky, the stars bright above them. She had made a choice, and it had changed everything. The future was still uncertain, but she was no longer running. With Miles by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. The power within her was just the beginning, and together they would find their way home.